Okay, so I put together a quick version of a use case, a TDM use case for SAP APIs, right? So I'm gonna focus this demo. I'm gonna basically walk through a little bit of about how it works, how you set it up, and then how it's used, and then I'll actually show it and demonstrate it inside of Test Data Manager. So the use case I'm working on is synthetic data generation through an SAP API. In this case, we're going to use an OData API. So looking at the first thing I want to do as a test data engineer is really kind of identify the SAP API, right? So in this particular case, I'm going to work with master data, but I basically want to go out, identify the API that I want to interact with. Once I understand or decide on the APIs I want to interact with, I would basically get the specification for that. Typically, this might be a JSON file or an XML file or some other type of specification, really focusing on the request body, right? If you, in this case, we're generating data, so I'm not exporting out of an environment and masking it. I'm actually just going to synthetically generate realistic data and push into a particular environment, right? So I would identify the API. I would get the specification details into a file as a test data engineer, and then I would register that with my project in TDM. So in this case, I'd register, or in this example, I'd register this JSON file with TDM as an object. And then TDM is going to be able to allow me or generate the assets I need to be able to create rules for this JSON file to generate realistic data. And then I can, basically that's creating my generation service that I'm going to expose. And once I validate this as a test data engineer that this is, going to work like I expect it to, I want to be able to publish it in the service catalog, right? So that's the general idea here. Now, specifically when you're working with APIs, what Test Data Manager does is take that API or that specification file and it utilizes a staging database. So that could be MySQL or SQL Server or whatever technology you want to use. But you would have some sort of database area, like an empty database that you could point to. And Test Data Manager is going to analyze this specification and then generate a relational data model as a staging area to be able to generate data into, right? And then the next kind of piece of it, and this I'm just explaining what's happening under the covers, right? So the next kind of piece of it is when we generate or you create this generator to generate data into that staging area, the next piece is to be able to extract that generated data back into an API specification that you can then push to the API itself, right? So to automate that, TDM will have a job automation for the generation of the data based on the rules that the test data engineer sets up. But then the pushing it to the API is very specific to every target environment. So we have Javelin, which is a workflow automation tool that allows you to create a graphical workflow to be able to automate, common test data management tasks. And in this particular case, what we're trying to automate is calling the SAP API and pushing this generated data in the JSON format right into the API, right? And then making that a part of the generation process. So it becomes a post-action step to this generation process. So I'll show that in the demo. But once you've actually completed those, then you can publish it as a service where testers can come in and use this now test data service that's been created for them to be able to push data into this environment, right? So basically, a tester would log in, they would go to their service catalog in Test Data Manager, they would select this particular data generation service, they would request the data to be generated for them. And then the generation service would go generate the data based on the rules that were defined in the generator. And those can be exported out into JSON files that then can be pushed into the SAP API, right? And so you would use, a test data engineer would have used Javelin to be able to automate this part of the process. So it's a very automated, repeatable process and attached it to the generator. So when the tester comes in and requests this service, part of the service is generating the data, but also calling the Javelin workflow to be able to push that to the API for the environment that they want to go to, right? So that's what I'm going to demonstrate here. So kind of going back to the API specification itself. In this particular case, I'm looking at master data for business partners, and I want to be able to get the specification for whatever APIs I'm going to use. And so I've identified in this use case that I want to be able to create business partners. Those could be people, they could be organizations, it could be groups, but in this demo, I'm just focusing on people and organizations. And so I would go to, you see there's lots of data you can work with here that are related to business partners, right? So related data, but I can look at business partners here specifically, and I can see that I can do a get call to the API to get a business partner. I can do a post call to be able to create a business partner. And there's various other methods supported here, for the different data pieces of a business partner, whether it's address or the tax information or other various aspects that make up the entire business partner and all its related data. Right. So I can see this here. I can look at the specification, and I can see right here, look, and this is going to give me application JSON. I think I thought this also supported XML, but maybe it doesn't. But JSON's what I wanted to work with anyway, so I can actually see what the example data structure would look like. So this gives me my JSON specification. Now, this is a large specification, and depending on what the requirements are for what you want to expose in TDM, you may not need the entire specification. There's certain data that's required, other data is optional. What you need to do as a test data engineer and working with maybe an SAP functional consultant, understanding the requirements, is figure out, what aspects of the business partner have to be defined. What are the different types of business partners, like what regions you might want to work within, what their tax identification numbers are, or how you might want to generate those, right? So these are things that, like in the synthetic data generation, these are the things you need to think about from a data requirements perspective. What type of capabilities do you want to expose to a tester to be able to customize a business partner and generate different types of business partners in this example, right? So this gives me my specification. So what I can do is I can come into Test Data Manager, I can go into my project, and just to give you an idea on what I chose in this use case, I tried to keep it fairly simple so I could create this quickly. But this is part of the specification that I took, right? There's some required fields in here, like defining who the business partner name is, what their address is, their tax information, and those are the pieces that I exposed for this. Of course, if the requirements deem that you need more of the specification, then you would include that as a part of your JSON structure. So I can then, as a test data engineer, I can come in and say, okay, I want to register, right? I go into objects, I can say register new object, and then I can select, like, for example, JSON file. I can, whatever I want to call it, in this case, create business partner, for example, and then I can upload the JSON file. Now, when I upload the JSON file, what it's going to do is register that JSON file. So here you see I have one already registered. And then there'll be an option in here, a little button that you can click that says, go ahead and drive tables for this. And what this is doing is Test Data Manager will generate a set of relational tables. These are the tables that it generated for me already, but when you come in here, it'll allow you to pick your database connection and what schema you want to publish to, or which database you want to publish to. Which would be coming from your connection profiles, right? So this would choose your staging area where you want to connect. So in this case, I'm using a connection profile that I called staging that connects to a SQL Server database. And TDM went in and generated this schema, this schema here, along with these tables. And there's relationships between these tables to basically maintain the appropriate data integrity, for that API call, right? So now that I have this, I can then use this to create a generator, which I've done here. This is, let's see, which one's the API one? Oh, so I have two generators. They're both for API, but you can see here I can come in, I can create a new generator. I can then select the tables that I want to use, which would be those tables that were generated for me by TDM in our staging area. And then here I can then a lot of these things like the IDs and everything you don't have to worry about. TDM takes care of that for you as far as the relationships and generating unique IDs for the staging area. The part that you care most about is coming in and like this one I created is defining a person. So the business partner category is one for a person. And then I'm using synthetic data generation rules to be able to say, okay, well, when I'm generating a person, what rules do I want to use? So I've defined those for all the various fields, right? So the naming of the organization or the person. I'm also defining, in this case, it's a person. So I'm using U.S. Social Security number. So I'm generating Social Security numbers for the tax type for a U.S. individual because this is creating a U.S. business partner in this particular case. Um, and then I'm also assigning the address and setting that up as well, right? So I have, TDM will come in from an addressing perspective. Let's see, here's the addresses. You set region, city, postal name, street name. So I can actually generate realistic addresses. So it's in the right state. It's a city that belongs to that state. It's a zip code that belongs to that city. So it's, the integrity of the data is kind of aligned. So that's all defined here. And now I can use this generator to be able to publish data, right? So I've defined a configuration. This configuration is what will be the tester to be able to use. They won't see all this detail. This is me, the test data engineer, setting this up, but it's basically saying, look, when they generate data, I want to generate data to staging under this schema, and these are the tables that are involved, right? That's basically what I'm exposing here. So I have that ability. The other thing that I'm also defining, because this is an API, right? So we're not going directly just to a database. We need to then take that data we generated and put it into an API. So I have some actions here I've defined. One of them is every time I generate data, I get rid of old records that I've generated, right? So I'm not republishing, data that I've published before. So I'm going to go ahead and truncate all the data in the staging area. And then once I truncate the data, the generator will generate data. And then as a post action, right? So that was a pre-action. As a post action, I'm going to publish that data to the API, right? So this is a Javelin workflow, right? So this is defined and uploaded here. API to publish a business partner. I mean, basically, once you create your Javelin workflow, you just name it and then drag it into here. And then now you can make that workflow available to attach as an action in a generator, right? So just to kind of show you what that workflow looks like, this is my Javelin workflow. It starts here. I've defined a process to get my API token. So I'm going to call TDM. TDM's API so I can export the data out of the staging area into JSON files. So TDM has a function for that. When I call that job to export the data, I'm going to monitor that job execution. I'm then going to download the generated data, which will be in a zip file, and I'll extract that zip file. And then now that I have these JSON files with synthetically generated data in the right specification structure, I'm then going to call the SAP API using post commands to be able to push that data. That's basically what this workflow does, right? So I've created that. I've attached it to my generator, and now as a tester, I can log in and then use this function, right? So as a tester, if I log in, I'll see what's been exposed to me. I select my create business partners, OData API service. I can come in here and I can say, well, what do I want? I want a person or I want an organization, right? That's up to me. That's what the test data engineer is exposed to me. I can choose which environment I'm going to post to. That's that configuration that the test data engineer set up. And then I can choose how many I need, right? So in this case, I'll just do 2. And as a test data engineer, you may not want a tester to be able to go in and say, I want to generate, 100,000 business partners. Right. So you might want to put some rules on this to say, like, they can generate up to 5 or whatever it is, right? Whatever the requirements are, that's something that test data engineer can configure. In this case, I just put 2, and then I go ahead and request this. So that's going to kick off a job. In this case, 1181, you can see this job running. And that's actually going to go run, this process, right? So if I go back to looking at my presentation, it's going to basically, I click this, it's going to generate the data into the staging area, export these JSON files, and then it's going to post that data to the API, right, using Javelin. And so that's what's actually happening right now. It doesn't take very long. So I'll refresh and see we're completed already. So that data has been generated. I can, as a test data engineer, I can actually, this is exposed to me. If I was a tester, I wouldn't see these options. As a test data engineer, at any time, I can come in here and look at the data that was generated, the actual JSON files, right? So I can just export those. That's what that Javelin flow basically did for me, right? So if I go and look at these JSON files as a test data engineer, I can see, what we actually looked at here. And I think I have to actually extract this first. So let me extract this, and you can see here. So you can see that's the data that we generated, right? It's synthetically generated. Now, if I wanted to go back to, as a tester, my job, I can come here and I can see the logs, right? So if there was an error, as a tester, you can come in and say, oh, well, I had an error. You might want to sync up with the test data engineer. But I can actually see, look, we truncated some rows from a previous run. And then we basically inserted the 2 records into the staging area, right? Well, it's across multiple tables, right? There's a bunch of related data making up that API call. So I can see that took place. I can also see the logs of the workflow, right? So I can, and what's exposed in here is what I've exposed as a test data engineer when I created it. So I output data so I could kind of see what's going on, information. But right here, I can see the actual business partner that was created. So this is the response that came back. That allows me to be able to say, okay, well, let me go look at that business partner. So this is 1,178. So if I go log into my SAP environment, and I go to business partner, and what did I say that was? 1,178. Then I can come in here and look at what was generated, right? So I can open this up. I can see we generated an organization. The name of the organization was Gunver. The address is here, right? I can see the address is set up as my default address for my standard address. I can also see that the tax information was generated properly, right? So I can see that here, US tax ID number. So, this, I can come in and validate it, and then I can start using this data for my testing, right? So this is just kind of a simple use case to kind of show how that might work. Hopefully this was helpful in understanding how TDM would interface with the API for SAP.